Welcome back. In this installment of the Differential Reinforcement series, we focus on DRI and the closely related DRA. Let's look first at differential reinforcement of incompatible behaviors. Incompatible, meaning that the action that we reinforce is oppositional to the inappropriate behavior that is presently being displayed. By reinforcing a behavior that cannot be performed at the same time as the action of concern, we help the youngster to block the demonstration of the maladaptive behavior. We promote a behavior that gets in the way of the errant action that the student's been showing. In order to implement DRI, we must identify a behavior that simply can't be performed at the same time as the one we strive to eliminate. We provide enough reinforcement and guidance to assure that the preferred one is demonstrated, one that parries or prevents the non-preferred conduct. If you're unfamiliar with the term topographic, that word refers to the shape, the appearance, the form of an action. For example, the appearance, form, and movement of throwing a ball is topographically different than that of kicking that sphere. In fact, you can't be throwing the solitary ball when you're giving it the boot. They are topographically incompatible. One can't be done while demonstrating the other. We've got a student who places his head down on the desk and attempts to sleep. What's incompatible with that? Of course, we're going to reinforce the youngster for staying awake, because you can't sleep if you're awake. Sometimes it's that simple. Perhaps we have him or her stand or walk with a clipboard to further assist the youngster in keeping the eyes open. So the opposite of slumber is alertness. While the brain might not be functioning at its best, we'll define alertness in observable and measurable terms. Physically observable actions. One version, depending on the situational circumstances, might be stated as student has eyes open and nose pointed towards speaker. So, put on your thinking caps and let's devise some incompatible behaviors for the ones that you're about to see on your screen. Which action would be contrary to being off task, being disengaged with the lesson or activity? That was a no-brainer, right? The opposite of off task is on task. However, remember that we must define our behaviors in observable and measurable terms. Now we've got to engage a bit more brain power. How do we define this state of being? On task. Pause the podcast at this point and think of how you might define that behavior for the many venues and activities that we direct during the day, and the various ways that we expect kids to be on task. How can we specifically define one behavior that suffices for all academic settings? Pause the podcast now. How did you do? Well, here's one to consider. Engaged in the activity of the moment in the manner expected for that activity. That definition would cover just about every set of circumstances, yes? Think of a behavior that is incompatible with being out of contact with one's seat. Then devise a definition for that action. The actions in your definition should be, you guessed it, observable and measurable. But be certain that it's a sitting position that can be maintained for a long period of time and is suitable for all activities. For example, do you really want the youngster's hands folded on the desktop all moments of the day? How would he or she complete the assignment in that case? 2 feet on the floor at all times? Could you sit in that way at a professional development session for half an hour? Yes, pull in the reins, but you don't want them to be too tight. Keep them a tad bit loose. Pause the podcast at this point and define in seat. Here is one very loose reins definition in which the youngster's bottom must be touching the flat part of the desk. I do see one problem with it. Have you spotted it? Yes, there are 2 horizontal planes on the chair, the seat part and the armrest writing part of the desk. So we'll need to do some rewording here. Most teachers would probably also wish for at least 1 foot on the floor. However, modifications are oftentimes made to definitional wording depending on the present status of the learner's ability to stay in the seat. For example, I recollect one particularly active pupil in my classroom back in the day. He was regularly out of his seat and roaming about the room. In an attempt to modify that behavior, I defined the action that I did want to witness, something that was attainable by that very active student. For the first few days, the definition of in seat was any part of body in contact with any part of chair. As we became more capable of showing that behavior, we upped the ante to the definition that you see here. Later, we would add nose pointed toward speaker, 1 foot on the floor, and the previous definition that we saw for on task. As an addendum to that story, we did allow him the privilege of roaming about a specified area with a clipboard holding his work, his paperwork, as long as he was on task. At other times, we provided him with 2 desks. When he just couldn't sit in that seat any longer, he could get up and walk over to his other seat, giving him a short and direct movement when he really needed it. Being on task and in seat for a period of time also earned him walking breaks in the hallway. There were approved student monitors who sat at desks at the ends of the hallway to check passes or report problems, so he was supervised. Backing up the bus to our definition of in seat, you may have recognized that we used a shaping procedure, something that's covered in the Positive Parenting podcast here on Behavior Advisor and another one of our sessions on Behavior Advisor. Let us assume that you're using a behavior recording procedure, a data recording procedure known as momentary time sampling to gather data on in-seat behavior. At a cue, you make one of two marks. Yes, he is in his seat right now mark, like a plus sign or a check mark, or a different mark such as a minus sign or an arrow pointing down for he is not in his seat at this moment. You'll then figure out the percent of times that he was in his seat when the tone sounded, and we wish over time to increase that percentage. So, the timer tone sounds, cueing you to assess the student's behavior at that exact moment and make a mark that represents what you witnessed. Does this boy get credit for having any part of body in contact with any part of chair? Perhaps we should suspend the observation periods until the youngster's back in the classroom. Which behavior is oppositional to elopement, the school-based kind? Being in the classroom when the tone randomly sounds, if we're using momentary time sampling, or being inside the classroom for some or all of a designated period of time, if we're using a data recording procedure known as interval recording to collect our data. To reiterate an earlier reminder, those data collection procedures are covered in the session on behavioral data recording. Oh yes, here's one of our primary concerns. If only those kids would follow our directions, everything would run smoothly, I could teach, and the kids could learn. But even follows directions can be a tad bit vague and nebulous. Let's narrow down the wording for the action that we wish to have displayed and decide which dimension of the behavior to measure. Usually when we're engaged in behavioral data recording, we're concerned with frequency, how often, or the duration of the behavior, how long. But it really could be any one of the 6 characteristics of an action that we could measure for change. You'll find more on these measurement matters in the sessions on dimensions of behavior and the behavior data recording. Here's one possible definition for follows directions. I recall another shaping plan that I implemented with my former students. I taught tough street kids, most of whom were labeled as having conduct disorders. Initially, they frequently resisted complying with directions from this middle-class male from outside their cultural group. I found that a certain manner of phrasing, as is outlined in the webinar series on this site, was necessary for success with these young people. Making use of that phrasing helped to build positive interpersonal relationships, an essential component in convincing them to actively engage in their education. You gotta like the messenger if you're going to listen to the message. The phrasing that built and maintained our relationships also worked to gain greater compliance with my expectations over time. In the first part of this whole class shaping program, following directions was initially defined as compliance within 1 minute of the initial request with 2 or fewer reminders. So, it might sound something like this. Antoine, would you please join our group at the table so that we can get started? Notice the invitational approach versus ordering compliance, and the provision of a reason why the action was important so that we can get started. More on giving effective directions, praise, and criticism in sessions found on Behavior Advisor. Even then, with that well-phrased utterance, Antoine had to show that he had some power. Power he did indeed possess, as his frazzled and frightened former teachers would attest. He was immune to disciplinary procedures, laughing at the school's major penalties, and I certainly couldn't pick him up and plop him in his seat. When I uttered the invitation to join the group, he might stroll over to the paper and pencil area, but he was alert to any urging on my part to hurry up the pace, to which he would respond with, "I'm effing getting to it, back off!" He was allowed that minute to comply with the initial request, and my paraprofessional and I learned to use a smile and a nod toward his chair as a reminder. Verbal reminders were counterproductive with Antoine. Yes, after he sorted through the pencils and grabbed a sheet of paper, he would look over at me, at which point I would smile and nod before looking over at his chair and then back at him. He would then, with a slow stroll, take a seat, at which time I could mouth the words, "Thank you." For individual work, I'd stroll over to Antoine in order to be certain that he experienced a successful start on the assignment. For group work, his table partners would bring him up to speed on the task. Over time, he, like the other students in my self-contained class for kids with mental health and behavior disorders, responded more quickly and to more subtle initial cues and signals. We had created, over the course of a couple of weeks, a relatively cooperation-oriented learning environment as we established a welcoming, respectful, and safe place. One that was physically, intellectually, and psychologically safe. One where they could let down their street-corner defenses and do what they'd always wanted to do from the start of their school career. Learn. Don't get me wrong, this was no educational utopia, but the power of phrasing and positivity and the relationships was borne out. If you work with intervention and relationship-resistant kids, take a peek at the sessions on Teaching Tough Kids here on BehaviorAdvisor.com. Let's consider one more. You have a student who spends a great deal of time with their hand in their mouth. And, oops, this is mouth and hand, my apologies. Yikes, this looks too much like the start of a bulimic incident, and we're not sticking around for that. Although, we could certainly implement a differential reinforcement procedure combined with therapeutic counseling. There we go. This image will serve as your homework assignment. And when you're devising the incompatible action, do consider the reason for the frequent and persistent aberrant behavior so that your promoted positive behavior meets the same need, be it sensory, psychological, or another purpose. Oh, but which needs? Those identified by William Glasser? Contained in the Circle of Courage model? Those of Rudolf Dreikurs? Or Abraham Maslow? Let's move from DRI to DRA, differential reinforcement of alternative behaviors. It should be noted that many writers view differential reinforcement of incompatible behaviors, the one we were talking about previously, and the lesser known DRC, differential reinforcement of communication. Many writers see DRI and DRC as subtypes of this DRA. For our purposes, we're going to separate them into distinct procedures. So, as for DRA, not all behaviors have a mirror opposite that allows us to engage in DRI. Sometimes we must use a behavior that is simply more palatable to us and society in general, and hopefully distracts the youngster from displaying the undesirable action. DRA is used when the function or purpose of the behavior is understandable and valid, but the current form of expressing this need or want is unacceptable. For example, we all need assistance in our efforts at times, but the manner in which we draw the attention of a knowledgeable person matters. Rude directions to "come over here," shouted at the instructor, or pulling upon the clothing of the adults to draw them closer, is inappropriate. In the second item, the holding of a tissue box, preventing pushing, this replacement behavior is not incompatible, but it hopefully distracts the youngster from the undesirable act of pushing others and motivates the youngster to take pride in his or her assigned duty as the person who is summoned when someone in line sneezes. For many kids, having something to do with their hands prevents the inappropriate hand behavior, even if the promoted action is not blocking that conduct by being incompatible. Can you think of some other examples of DRA substitution of replacement behaviors? Pause the session and devise a few. How about saying "thank you" instead of simply nodding the head? Saying "hello, nice to meet you" instead of "hey" or "you" when meeting an adult? Instead of storming into the room, slapping other students on the back of the head to announce one's arrival and loudly plopping into the seat, all to draw attention to oneself, we promote the alternative action of banging on the door 3 times, saying "hi everyone" as he or she enters, and walking with hands to oneself over to the desk. We'll get rid of those 3 bangs on the door later. We're progressively shaping the final behavior we wish to see. The shaping procedure and its close cousin task analysis are fully described in the Positive Parenting Practices series and elsewhere on Behavior Advisor. How about promoting the action of the student raising his or her hand to be recognized instead of calling out the answers? Of course, the youngster could display both behaviors at the same time, but even so, we say, "thanks for raising your hand. What would you like to contribute?" Focusing on the hand-raising part. Initially, we offer the opportunity to respond whenever the hand is raised with no shout-out. This every-time recognition of a behavior is known as the continuous reinforcement for frequency. It's used to build a behavior. Later, we'll adjust the reinforcement schedule to fade out the rewards. You can learn more about this fading of reinforcement in the Schedules of Reinforcement session. Another example of DRA. Consider a boy or girl who places his or her head down on the desktop when the work seems to be too difficult. The alternative behavior is for the youngster to request help and cooperate with an adult or peer to engage in the assignment. Yes, the head could still go down, but we accept answers from the youngster and promote a head turn, or heads up, so to speak, by increasing the success and using prompts from us to take a look at this. With regard to the first point on your screen, remember to avoid identifying which behavior to stop. Instead, tell the student which action to display. You can find out more about the importance of this phrasing in the Verbal Aikido webinar on the Behavior Advisor site. In the second point on your screen, we're reminded that while differential reinforcement procedures are typically positive in nature, they can sometimes be made more forceful and influential by administering penalties for displays of the forbidden actions. Do remember to stay on the side of positivity with regard to the emphasis of your intervention and your phrasing. Last, there are certain advisories, cautions, and other things to keep in mind. First of all, we need to remember that human beings engage in behavior for a reason. We need to figure out that reason, and our alternative behavior needs to match that reason. Additionally, we've got to give them more reason to engage in this new alternative behavior. It should require less effort and/or bring at least the same payoff, the same amount of benefits. So the youngster says, "Oh, I think I'm going to give this a try." A few more things of which we need to be mindful. In order to find out the reason, the drive, the purpose, the function behind the student's present behavior, we need to conduct a functional behavior assessment. Find out the reason for that behavior. Then we can better select a replacement behavior. We need to be certain that our replacement behavior can actually be demonstrated by the youngster. Does the youngster have the developmental level, the maturity to show it, the physical capability? And would any self-respecting kid of that group really want to show that behavior? Sometimes we select behaviors that we would hope to see in the ideal child. However, we need to be certain that the youngster sees the utility of using it around his or her peers in his life. We have the reminder there to use the CRF schedule. Yes, that continual reinforcement for frequency schedule. We want to build behaviors with it before we then fade out the reinforcement. You'll find full coverage of the matter in the Schedules of Reinforcement session. That completes our session on DRA and DRI. I'm Tom McIntyre. I want to thank you for joining me here today, and I look forward to mind melding with you again soon in another session on differential reinforcement or any of the other myriad topics found here on BehaviorAdvisor.com.